Most young quarterbacks enter the league fighting for snaps, respect, and patience. Shedeur Sanders walked in fighting something else entirely, a narrative that was written long before his first NFL throw. Every pass, every press conference, every quiet moment on the sideline has been filtered through one unavoidable detail: his last name. Not his footwork, not his reads, not his leadership, just the weight of expectations that don't come with a playbook and can't be shaken with a good stat line. Because being the son of Deion Sanders isn't just a headline, it's a constant test. Some people expect greatness without patience. Others wait for failure just to say it was inevitable. That's the uncomfortable space Shedeur has lived in since the moment he became a serious football prospect. Not judged like a rookie, not criticized like a project, but evaluated like a symbol. And in today's NFL, symbols get torn apart faster than players ever do. That's why it stopped people in their tracks when Joe Burrow spoke up. Not with hype, not with viral quotes, just a calm, deliberate acknowledgement that cut straight through the noise. Burrow didn't talk about bloodlines or branding. He talked about composure, about handling pressure, about professionalism in moments where most young quarterbacks crack. Coming from someone who knows what it's like to be dissected, doubted, and put under a microscope, that kind of recognition landed differently. It wasn't trendy, it was earned. And that's where this story really starts. Not with the name on the back of the jersey, but with the way Shedeur moves when everything around him is loud. The way he answers questions without feeding the chaos. The way he plays when the spotlight tightens. Because while critics argue about where he came from, something else has been happening quietly. Teammates are responding, coaches are trusting, opposing quarterbacks are paying attention. And whether people are ready to admit it or not, the league is starting to see a quarterback who isn't trying to escape the shadow, he's learning how to operate inside it. Long before Shedeur Sanders ever took a snap in the NFL, the narrative around him was already locked in. Not because of something he said or did, but because of something he couldn't change. His last name opened doors, sure, but it also stacked expectations so high that anything short of perfection felt like failure. For many fans and analysts, Shedeur wasn't entering the league as a quarterback trying to develop. He was entering as a verdict waiting to be delivered. Being the son of Deion Sanders meant every move came with assumptions attached. If he played well, skeptics said it was access or advantage. If he struggled, it confirmed what they already believed. That double standard created an uneven playing field from the start. While other young quarterbacks were allowed room to grow, Shedeur was expected to arrive fully formed. No grace period, no learning curve, just instant validation or instant dismissal. That pressure followed him everywhere. From college to draft night, cameras weren't just tracking his mechanics, they were tracking reactions. Was he confident enough? Too confident? Was he calm or was he protected? The questions never settled on football alone. They lingered around optics, image, and lineage, as if his identity mattered more than his preparation. And in a league obsessed with measurable traits, Shedeur was being evaluated on something impossible to quantify: perception. What made it heavier was the tone of the criticism. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was subtle, wrapped in backhanded concern or cautious praise. Phrases like "we'll see" or "he's got a lot to prove" followed him longer than they did others. Not because his tape demanded it, but because his name invited it. There were people waiting for a stumble, ready to turn it into a statement about
privilege rather than progress. That kind of scrutiny doesn't fade after one good drive or one clean game. It lingers. Yet instead of pushing back publicly or leaning into the spotlight, Shedeur moved differently. No social media outbursts, no defensiveness in interviews. He didn't pretend the weight wasn't there, but he refused to let it steer him. While narrative swirled, he stayed deliberate, choosing preparation over posturing, consistency over commentary. And that restraint started to stand out, especially in an environment where noise usually invites more noise. Because the truth is, living under a famous shadow doesn't just test talent, it tests patience, it tests identity, And for Shedeur, the real challenge wasn't proving he belonged on the field, it was convincing people to look at the field at all. And just when the conversation seemed stuck there, someone from the other side of the spotlight decided to change it. Joe Burrow isn't the type to speak unless there's a reason. He doesn't chase headlines, and he doesn't hand out praise just to be polite. In a league where sound bites get recycled and compliments get exaggerated, Burrow has built a reputation for saying only what he means. That's exactly why people paused when Joe Burrow decided to address what he was seeing from Shedeur Sanders. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was intentional. What stood out to Burrow had nothing to do with hype. It wasn't draft position or highlight throws. It was how Shedeur handled the parts of the job that don't show up on a stat sheet. The scrutiny, the expectations, the constant framing of his career through someone else's legacy. Burrow recognized that pressure because he's lived it himself, not through family ties, but through injuries, rebuilds, and the weight of being expected to carry a franchise. He knows what it looks like when a quarterback cracks, and more importantly, he knows what it looks like when one doesn't. Burrow focused on composure, on how Shedeur stayed steady while people waited for him to stumble, on the way he answered questions without feeding the circus, on how he led without forcing his voice into every moment. For Burrow, that restraint signaled something deeper than raw talent. It pointed to emotional control, the kind that separates quarterbacks who survive from quarterbacks who last. That's why his words carried weight. He wasn't evaluating Shedeur as a fan or analyst, he was reading him as a peer. There was also an undercurrent to Burrow speaking up that didn't go unnoticed. He wasn't just praising performance, he was pushing back on a bias, a quiet one, but a real one. The tendency to judge Shedeur based on assumptions rather than actions. Burrow made it clear that being the son of a football icon shouldn't automatically disqualify someone from being taken seriously. In a league that claims to value merit above all else, Burrow's message was a reminder that merit still has to be seen to matter. And coming from someone who understands how quickly narratives can turn ugly, that support mattered. It reframed the conversation without inflating it. Burrow didn't crown Shedeur. He didn't predict greatness. He simply acknowledged the professionalism he saw and challenged people to pay attention to the right things. Sometimes the most powerful statements in the NFL aren't declarations, they're corrections. And what Burrow did, intentional or not, was correct the lens people were using to look at a young quarterback still finding his footing. Because once that lens shifts, everything else starts to look different. When the praise came, Shedeur Sanders didn't lean into it. There was no victory lap, no subtle flex, no shift in tone meant to capitalize on the moment. In a league where recognition often turns into validation,
Branding fuel. Shedeur treated it like background noise. Appreciated, sure, but not something that altered his posture or his priorities. That alone caught people off guard. Instead of echoing the compliments or circling back to who said them, he kept his language grounded. He spoke about learning curves, about timing, about the work still ahead. Even when asked directly about the attention coming from respected peers, his answers stayed measured. No chest thumping, no "I told you so," just quiet acknowledgement followed by a quick pivot back to preparation. The moment never became about validation, it became about responsibility. That approach extended to how he handled pressure as a whole. Shedeur didn't deny that it existed, he didn't downplay the weight of expectations or pretend criticism didn't reach him. He simply refused to let it dictate how he moved. When questioned about the scrutiny that comes with his last name, he didn't bristle or deflect with rehearsed sound bites. He answered plainly. Pressure was part of the job. Growth was part of the process. Running from either would be pointless. There was a maturity in how he framed it, one that felt earned rather than coached. He talked about discipline, showing up early, staying consistent when nobody's watching. These weren't flashy answers, but they were revealing. They showed a player more concerned with stacking good days than stacking headlines. In an era where perception can sometimes outpace performance, Shedeur seemed comfortable letting the work catch up on its own time. What stood out most was what he didn't do. He didn't use the moment to separate himself from critics or elevate himself above expectations. He didn't weaponize praise against doubt. There was no defensiveness hiding beneath the calm, just an understanding that attention, positive or negative, doesn't move the chains on Sunday. Execution does. And that steadiness wasn't accidental. It hinted at something deeper, a mindset built to absorb pressure without reacting to it, the kind that doesn't rise or fall with public opinion, the kind that keeps a quarterback centered when the noise gets loud. And as the questions kept coming, especially the uncomfortable ones, Shedeur made it clear he wasn't interested in managing narratives. He was interested in managing the moment. There was no avoiding it forever. Eventually, the conversation always bends back to the same place, the comparisons, the expectations, the shadow that follows everywhere. When asked directly about his father, Shedeur Sanders didn't flinch, but he also didn't perform. He didn't rush to distance himself, and he didn't lean on the legacy for protection. His response lived in the middle, calm, deliberate, and unmistakably his own. He acknowledged the history without letting it define the present. He spoke with respect about Deion Sanders, but he was clear about one thing: he isn't here to replay anyone else's career. There was no resentment in his tone, no fatigue from the question, just clarity. He understands the expectations attached to his name, but he also understands that expectations don't win games. Execution does. Accountability does. What made that distinction powerful was how naturally it came across. It didn't sound rehearsed or defensive. It sounded lived in, like something he'd already accepted long before reporters asked him about it. He wasn't trying to escape the comparison. He was reframing it, not as a burden, not as a shortcut, but as something outside his control. And instead of fighting that reality, he narrowed his focus to what he could actually influence: how he prepares, how he responds, and how he shows up for his teammates. That perspective showed maturity far beyond his years. Many players pushed into this situation either leaned too hard into the legacy or tried too aggressively to separate from it. Shedeur did neither. He carried himself like someone who knows that identity isn't declared, it's built, rep by rep, week by week, answer by answer. When questions got pointed, he stayed respectful. When they tried to bait emotion, he redirected calmly. The message was subtle but firm. This isn't about erasing history, it's about writing new chapters. Inside the room, that approach mattered. Teammates weren't responding to a name or a brand, they were responding to consistency. Coaches weren't coaching a legacy, they were coaching a quarterback who listened, adjusted, and owned his role. By refusing to either run from or hide behind his father's success, Shedeur carved out space to be evaluated on his own terms, not loudly, not dramatically, but intentionally. Because in a league obsessed with narratives, sometimes the most powerful statement is refusing to play into one. When the Browns lined up against the Bengals, it stopped being theory. This wasn't about practice habits, interviews, or long-term potential anymore. This was real time, real pressure, real eyes on every throw. For Shedeur Sanders, the matchup carried extra weight whether he acknowledged it or not. Across the field stood Joe Burrow, a quarterback whose words had already shifted the conversation. Now came the part where talk either held up or fell apart. From the first few drives, the game moved fast. The Bengals weren't subtle with their intentions. Pressure packages came early, disguises came often, and mistakes were waiting to be baited. For many young quarterbacks, that kind of environment leads to panic, rushed throws, forced decisions, unnecessary risks. But Shedeur didn't bite. His footwork stayed clean, his eyes stayed disciplined. He took what the defense gave him and didn't pretend he needed to be the hero on every snap. What stood out wasn't a single highlight throw, it was control. He ran the offense with a steady tempo, communicating at the line, adjusting protections, keeping the operation calm even when the pocket tightened. When plays broke down, he didn't drift backward or gamble into chaos. He slid, reset, and delivered. No desperation heaves, no emotional decisions, just efficient football. The kind that doesn't light up social media but wins trust inside a locker room. The Bengals tested him repeatedly, especially in moments where a mistake could swing momentum. Third downs, late clock situations, quick pressure up the middle. And each time, Shedeur responded the same way, with restraint. He wasn't trying to outduel Burrow throw for throw. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to execute. That distinction mattered. It showed a quarterback who understood the situation rather than being consumed by it. As the game tightened, the spotlight sharpened, cameras lingered, analysts leaned in. This was the exact setting people use to decide what a young quarterback is made of. And instead of shrinking under the expectation, Shedeur looked comfortable inside it, not energized by the moment, not overwhelmed by it, just locked in. The pressure didn't elevate his emotions, but it didn't suppress his play either. By the time the final sequences unfolded, the takeaway was clear. This wasn't a rookie overwhelmed by the moment or distracted by narrative. This was a quarterback who treated a high-scrutiny matchup like a job to be done. And in a league that exposes nerves quickly, that kind of composure spoke louder than any stat line ever could.
Away from the cameras and the post-game debates, the evaluation of Shedeur Sanders sounded very different. Inside the building, there was no interest in narratives or last names. That's where Kevin Stefanski kept the focus narrow and intentional. When asked about Shedeur's development, he didn't reach for buzzwords or dramatic praise. He talked about habits, consistency, coachability, the things that don't trend but determine longevity. Stefanski's message was subtle but revealing. He emphasized that growth isn't measured by a single Sunday, it's measured Monday through Saturday. How a quarterback prepares, how he handles corrections, how he responds when something doesn't work on tape. And in those areas, Shedeur had been steady, not flashy, not entitled, just present every day, ready to absorb information and apply it. That reliability mattered more to the staff than any outside noise. What Stefanski pointedly avoided was just as important as what he said. He didn't get pulled into discussions about lineage. He didn't frame Shedeur as a project tied to a famous name. He spoke about him like any other quarterback in the room, one responsible for learning protections, commanding meetings, and earning trust rep by rep. That separation wasn't accidental. It reflected how the locker room was already viewing him, not as an extension of someone else's legacy, but as a professional accountable to the standard in Cleveland. Behind the scenes, Shedeur's presence had begun to register, taking control during walkthroughs, asking the right questions in meetings, speaking up when timing needed tightening, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that signaled ownership. Coaches notice that. Players do too. Those are the moments when leadership quietly forms, long before fans ever label it that way. Stefanski also touched on something that doesn't get enough attention with young quarterbacks: emotional regulation. How a player responds to mistakes often tells more than how he reacts to success. According to the staff, Shedeur didn't spiral after misreads or missed opportunities. He corrected, adjusted, and moved on. That calm carried over into practice tempo, in game prep, creating a sense of stability the offense could lean on. Inside that locker room, the evaluation was already shifting, not based on hype, not based on outside validation, but on trust. Trust built through repetition, accountability, and preparation, the kind that can't be fast-tracked or inherited. And the more Shedeur showed up the same way every day, the clearer it became. Whatever conversation existed outside the building, inside it, he was being judged on exactly one thing: how he worked. The line landed quietly, but it stayed. When Shedeur Sanders said, "Dig one ditch, better dig two," it didn't sound like a threat or a clapback. There was no edge in his voice, no hint of frustration trying to sneak through. It felt more like a reminder, old wisdom delivered without emotion. And that's why it hit harder than any fiery quote ever could. In a league where players often feel pressure to respond publicly to doubt, Shedeur chose a different route. He wasn't talking directly to critics, and he wasn't calling anyone out by name. He was outlining a philosophy, a belief that energy put out into the world has a way of circling back, that if you spend time trying to pull someone else down, you better be ready to deal with what comes from that.
It wasn't defensive, it was reflective. What made the moment resonate was how consistent it was with everything else he'd shown. He didn't follow the line with accusations. He didn't linger on it for emphasis. He just let it sit there and moved on. No explanation, no elaboration. Almost like he trusted people to understand what he meant. Meant without being spoon-fed the message. That restraint told you this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about maintaining focus. The quote quickly took on a life of its own, especially among those who had watched him be picked apart unfairly. But Shedeur never tried to reclaim it or repeat it for effect. He didn't turn it into a slogan. He didn't let it become his identity. For him, it was simply a boundary, a reminder to himself more than anyone else that he wasn't going to waste time wrestling with negativity he didn't create. And maybe that's why it stuck, because it wasn't aimed outward, it was inward, a commitment to staying steady when the noise grows loud, a warning against distraction. In an environment where players can get swallowed by reaction and retaliation, Shedeur chose discipline instead. Let the critics talk, let the opinions circulate. He'd rather answer with preparation, not commentary. The resilience showed up not in what he said next, but in what he did next. Practice reps, film sessions, drives where the game slowed down and decisions stayed clean. The quote became a marker, not a moment, a snapshot of how he approaches adversity without turning it into a spectacle. And as weeks went on, it became clear that the warning embedded in that phrase wasn't hollow, it was backed by work. Slowly at first, then all at once, the conversation started to change. Not because of a viral moment or a bold declaration, but because repetition has a way of quieting doubt. Week after week, Shedeur Sanders kept showing the same things: calm decisions, clean operation, and an understanding of game flow that didn't match the way people initially talked about him. The noise didn't disappear, but it lost its grip. What was once framed as a gamble, a late-round pick with a famous last name, began to look more like a case study in patience paying off. Coaches weren't speaking in hypotheticals anymore. Teammates weren't hedging their confidence. The locker room's trust showed up in body language, in timing routes, in how the huddle responded when things got tight. That shift wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Fans started to notice the details: the way he took the check down instead of forcing a throw, the way he reset protections without drawing attention to himself, the way mistakes didn't spiral into chaos. These weren't plays designed for highlight reels, but they were plays that kept drives alive. And over time, that consistency rewired perception. The question stopped being, "Can he handle this?" and started becoming, "How far can this go?" Even critics softened their language, not fully convinced, but no longer dismissive. The tone shifted from skepticism to evaluation, from waiting for collapse to watching for progression. That alone marked progress. In the NFL, respect doesn't usually arrive with applause, it arrives with preparedness. Opponents game plan differently, defenses disguised looks more carefully. That kind of attention only comes when a quarterback earns it. What made the shift more compelling was how little Shedeur acknowledged it. There was no change in cadence, no public acknowledgement that perception had turned. He kept pointing back to growth, to staying present, to earning trust one snap at a time. The narrative was moving whether he pushed it or not. And that's how identities in this league are truly formed, not through branding or loud statements, but through repetition that becomes impossible to ignore. Shedeur wasn't outrunning the shadow anymore. He was standing in his own space, not as someone trying to prove he belonged, but as someone quietly reminding people that he already does. In the end, this was never really about numbers on a stat sheet or headlines that disappear by Tuesday. It was about something harder to fake and much harder to maintain: control. Shedeur Sanders didn't try to silence critics with speeches or charm them with bravado. He let the work accumulate. He let the moments stack up. And slowly, quietly, the doubt started losing its voice. The recognition from Joe Burrow mattered not because it was praise, but because it was accurate. A quarterback seeing another quarterback for what he is, not what the internet argues him to be. Burrow didn't anoint him as finished or flawless. He acknowledged maturity. poise, and professionalism, traits that usually take years of hard lessons to develop, the kind that don't show up overnight and don't disappear when things get hard. What makes this story linger is the contrast. In a league obsessed with volume, loud personalities, louder opinions, non-stop narratives, Shedeur has moved in the opposite direction. No chasing validation, no trying to control perception, just discipline, preparation, and consistency. That kind of approach doesn't trend fast, but it lasts. It builds trust with coaches, it steadies teammates, and eventually it reshapes how the league talks about you. There's still plenty ahead, growth to be had, adjustments to make, no one pretending the work is finished, but what's already clear is this: the conversation has shifted because the evidence did, not because someone demanded it, not because someone shouted it into existence, but because repetition made denial uncomfortable. Quiet control beats loud doubt every time. And as this story continues to unfold in Cleveland, one thing feels undeniable. Shedeur Sanders isn't playing to escape a shadow anymore. He's building something of his own, and he's doing it the one way that can't be argued with: snap by snap, decision by decision. Earned.